Welcome to episode 24 of Tea, Coffee, and Torah. I am very excited to share with you the content of our new section we're going to get into this week. And that is going to be prophet scholarship in ancient Israel. And I'm not talking about prophetic scholarship. I'm talking about the scholarship of the prophets in Israel. Now, the traditional way for both religion and for scholars to view prophets is to see them as something where they have this inspiration where it just comes to them. Maybe they're in a trance like the prophet Balaam, and they just sprout something out because it comes into their head, and they're a designated prophet that has that ability to speak God's word. I want to challenge some of our inherited beliefs and some of our preconceived ideas regarding prophet scholarship. My theory that I would like to show you guys, not based on one or two texts, not based on even 10 or 20 texts, but based on hundreds of texts, is that prophets in ancient Israel followed what we would today term scholarship. They would quote from a primary source. In this case, it would be the written Torah. And then they would follow it up by quoting from and upholding the teachings, the ideas, the interpretation of their predecessors. So a lot of times when we read the phrase, the word of Yahweh unto, we look at that as though it is like something that is always direct and inspired. And sometimes it is. So sometimes there is a very specific word that comes to that prophet for him to speak. But more often than not, that phrase, the word of Yahweh unto, is them taking the written Torah and interpreting it in their day, applying it to their modern day situation. And what we find is that sometimes they quote from concepts that are found nowhere else but in the written Torah. And other times they are found, they quote exact phrases that are in the written Torah. Now, let me just clarify a concept regarding the written Torah. The Torah that we have today is in, 5 books. We have the Pentateuch. Originally, the Torah probably would have been 30, 40, 50 scrolls. You probably had a scroll maybe just for the Jubilees. You had a scroll just for the Book of War. You had a scroll just for these specific divisions of the law. Of course, the Aduth, the covenant, would have been something that was totally separate. You would have another book for the prophetic code, another book for history. So originally the Torah was very likely many, many books that very later in time were edited into what we have today. But so then because of this editing, the question then becomes, what is trustworthy? What can we rely on? And really the question comes down to, what did the prophets have? What did they have at their disposal that they could refer to and they could use during their day? Now, I want to give an example to you, because I think there is a standard that is forced on the biblical text that is alien to scholarship or to history writing in any ancient nation. And that is this idea that there has to be an exactness to everything that's said in the prophets, rather than just reiterating concepts. So let me see if I can. I'm going to do my best to give you a modern example of this. If I were to say that we have gun rights, most of you are going to know what I'm referring to. If I say I have the right to have a gun, you're going to know what document gives me that right. It's not the Code of Hammurabi that gives me the right to bear arms. It's no UN treaty that gives me the right to bear arms. If I talk about bearing arms, you even know what that means. If I say that, we know that even European common law doesn't give me the right to bear arms. The only thing that gives me the right to bear arms is found in the Second Amendment of the Constitution. But guess what? I don't have to say it comes from the Second Amendment of the Constitution, because most of us are well enough educated Americans that we know that. Well, let's take this to Jeremiah's date. Jeremiah lived 1,000 years after the Torah had been given to Israel. But, you know, they didn't have TVs. They didn't have a lot of our modern distractions. So what you would have had was a very classical society where much of the Torah would have been rehearsed. And there's actually a command in Deuteronomy to rehearse the Torah in the ears of your children, to pass it on. You know, very early scriptural scholarship was very, very critical of literacy in ancient Israel. And let me just stop here for a minute and clarify. If you have not seen it, because I don't think I mentioned it this episode, I had to start again because my internet went down. I did post a link to go get the Dropbox link that I posted to the Prophet Scholarship in Ancient Israel. I posted it this morning, so go get that document and follow along with me. Eventually, I'm going to move this over to my academia page, but I want to have a whole lot more content to this before I put it over there. So go get that document. I'm going to talk a little bit before we get into the actual material itself. But let's go back to ancient Israel. They would have been a very classical society, which means the Torah would have been rehearsed in their ears. Yes, you had writings, but these writings would have been told from fathers to sons. And it was the Levites' job to teach everyone the Torah, for them to know it. You know, again, this was part of the process of writing it in their hearts, was for them to know it verbatim by heart. The other thing that we find in early scholarship, and really just until maybe about the last 6 years, is that scholarship has been very critical of literacy in ancient Israel. And the assumption used to be that ancient Israel was an illiterate society. Very, very few people could read and write. Well, now with a lot of archaeological excavations, just so many things that have been unearthed, that has now changed. And now it's shifted to the idea that ancient Israel was a very literate society where even your average Joe, your average citizen, likely knew how to read and write. So that's a paradigm shift in the way that we approach it. So if Israel was a literate society, that means they had the means to read from the ancient Torah and to pass it down. So what we're going to look at today are these concepts. There's two things that I think we need to bear in mind. There's two ways that prophets quote from the Torah. Number one is going to be by reiterating a concept. It may not be verbatim, word for word, direct quote, but that concept resonates with everyone. Just like me, I can say, I can own a gun. I have the right to own a gun. You know what I'm talking about. I could say I have the right to bear arms. You still know what I'm talking about. I don't have to necessarily say this is from the U.S. Constitution, the Second Amendment within the U.S. Constitution. I mean, I don't have to say that because you guys know. Same with Scripture. You are speaking to an audience, Jeremiah, Isaiah. They are speaking to an audience that is well-versed, that knows this information by heart. So there's not a lot of clarification that is needed. Rather, all they have to do is evoke the concept because it's material that people would have been familiar with. But I want to give you an example of a direct quote where Jeremiah quotes from the law. This is specifically from Leviticus. You know, the argument among scholars, especially the documentary hypothesis, is that Jeremiah only had the book of Deuteronomy, and that was the only scroll that he had to work from. And yes, Deuteronomy does play a predominant role throughout the book of Jeremiah, but not the only book. So let's look at Jeremiah 2, verse 20. And we could honestly spend a whole 6 months in just Jeremiah chapter 2 because there's so many quotes from the written Torah in Jeremiah. So I'm going to read verse 2, and I'm going to read it in English because that's what most of you guys speak. It says, For of old time I have broken your yoke and burst your bands, and you said, I will not serve. When upon every high hill and under every green tree you wandered, playing the harlot. So this phrase from old time is in Hebrew, it's me olam, which means from forever. And this is the idea that Jeremiah is referring to something specific that is from ancient time. It is from forever ago. It's ages ago. And Jeremiah is going to quote from it. So when Jeremiah says, I have broken your yoke and burst your bands, This is actually a quote from Leviticus 26:13. And again, the ancient text would have not have had verses and chapters. It did have some white spaces. You know, the ancient text, I didn't even have white spaces. That actually comes in a little bit later, and in another invention of the scribes. But anciently, this would have just been words that would have run together. But thankfully today, we have the chapter and verse to be able to find them more readily and easy. So this is what it states in Leviticus. It says, I am Yahweh your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. You shall not be their bondmen. So we're talking about a freeing of slaves, a time of liberty, a time of setting forth. And it says, I have broken your bands and your yoke and made you go upright. This is the idea that, you know, slaves, under the heavy yoke of bondage, they're going to be bent over under the weight of their burdens. They don't have independence. They can't lift their heads up high because they can't stand or walk on their own 2 feet. They always have to answer to somebody. So it's this idea that you're being heavy laden and you're being burdened. And here we have the idea of liberty and freedom. But Jeremiah actually quotes from this almost verbatim. He uses the same word for I have broken, which is the first word. I have that in blue if you look on your chart. And then your yoke is the exact same word. And then there's a synonym that is used for bands. Leviticus uses matot, whereas Jeremiah, and I'm going to massacre this because I can read the Hebrew, but the speaking it, I'm not so good. So it says moasher. And please excuse my Hebrew there, but it's a synonym. When you look at where these words are used throughout the Tanakh, they mean the same things. They mean bands. They mean something that confines you, something that holds you hostage, so that you cannot move. And so here we have Jeremiah quoting from this, but then he's going to introduce a secondary concept, because we have the idea that this breaking of Israel's bands, them being freed out of the land of Egypt, is tied to their agreeing to obey a covenant. It is tied to them willing to not serve the gods of the surrounding nations, willing to not serve or work for them, but to serve Yahweh instead. So the second part of this, and I'm calling this 22b, states, and you said, I will not work or serve. That the word there can be used either way. And in the KJV, which if you guys are familiar with, it does translate that as I will not transgress. That's not an accurate translation. The idea of Israel will not work or serve. And this could be they would not work or serve other gods, or it could be they would not work on the Shabbat. But the context, if you read the rest of Jeremiah 2:20, the context there is the worship of other deities. So the concept really leads itself to the fact that Israel will not serve other deities. And then you find the only place that we have these ideas is going to be in Exodus 20 verse 5, where the command is given not to serve other deities. And it recurs again in Deuteronomy 5:9, where there is a command not to serve other deities. But then you find too that this idea is expanded a little bit, because both Exodus 19:7 and 8, Exodus 20 verse 19, as well as Deuteronomy 5:27, all contain this idea that Israel will not only not serve the deities of the land of Canaan, but they are agreeing to the covenant. So they are affirming, they are agreeing. It says, we will do it. We will hear it, listen. And oftentimes, the word hearken, the idea of listening and doing it, is a confirmation. It is a covenant that you are entering into, and you are accepting the terms of that covenant. So here we have two things. We have, a direct quote from Leviticus. So this does demonstrate that Jeremiah had some form of the written Torah. We also have Jeremiah recognizing the terms of the covenant, which included serving other deities, and Israel's agreement to abide by that contract, by that covenant. So this is only the very first text we're going to look at. I am trying to keep these rather short, hopefully with under about 20 minutes or so. So this is just the first verse. We are next time going to continue expanding this, looking at other concepts that are only derived from the Torah. Now, let me just reiterate this for just a minute, because we don't find anciently, and I'm just talking about ancient sources that would have existed before the fall of the first temple. We don't find this Israel specifically agreeing to the Torah in other written documents that have come later. You find this only in Exodus and Deuteronomy. You find forms of it in Numbers, but this does provide evidence, circumstantial perhaps right now, until we get the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence that shows that Israel had an ancient Torah within the time of Jeremiah, that Jeremiah could quote from. So this is just the very first episode of showing prophet scholarship in ancient Israel, and showing that that scholarship is not unlike modern scholarship today. So if you did not see it, please go back, and I did post the Dropbox links link to this document. Go and look at that, compare it, do the research yourself. Eventually I am going to do a series. I've got to have my computer set up because it's going to be a lot of screen sharing, where I want you to be able to search this for yourself, not rely on man. Don't rely on a teacher. Don't rely on a pastor, rabbi, teacher. I don't care who it is. Go search it for yourself. And I want to give you those tools to make it easy so you can do it yourself and kind of fulfill that idea where each of us can become messiahs, because we can stand on our own 2 feet. And it is that text that not only holds us accountable, but also empowers us. So today, if you will look for this episode 24 of Tea, Coffee, and Torah, actually it will be on my academia page, but I want to build this out, probably have maybe 30 or more pages. And I'll end up doing this in a series, because the number of texts where prophets quote from the Torah is so vast that not one publication will be able to hold all of those texts. So anyways, so I hope this you'll consider this information. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, and I hope you enjoy a cup of joe as you read through the document. Have a great day.